Morning, everyone. This is actually our last class in this particular series. It's been going on for quite a while. The recordings, if you're interested, they're all on our YouTube channel. You can find that on the homepage. You go to the just top left YouTube channel, and then it's been going on for a long time, so it'd be difficult to find all of them. I don't know if they're in a playlist. They might be. I don't do the YouTube channel. I'm not sure, but they are all there. If you go to the event page, where you probably all saw in the calendar, the very bottom of that, there's a link that says course materials. And for every class, we have a workbook. So there's one for today. Also, even though it's the last class still, you get a workbook. So if you did come across either, if you wanted to use that for today, or you just, you come across a past video and you're like, oh, I just want to utilize the workbook, you're welcome to. It gives you different contemplations and journal exercises and different things to kind of, because we only have one day to talk about each of these topics. It's not very long. The premise of this class is that in every class we talk about one constructive state of mind, one beneficial state of mind that we introduce. And this class, the um, states of mind, the topics are generally universal. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are things that are specific to Tibetan Buddhism that you don't find in the wider culture, and we don't focus on those. We focus on these universal values, and then we find ways of discussing how they relate to Buddhism and also how they relate to a more general context. So it's not a purely secular class. Again, it's the last one, so not that relevant, but that's the approach. There will be, Elaine starts tomorrow. She'll be here for all of March. She will be doing the Sunday class, which is on understanding the mind, and also kind of a hybrid secular Buddhist approach in that class. She will be doing a Saturday workshop as well, which is 10 to 3:30 on the 14th. That is more Buddhist in its focus, and it is on, if you're thinking about doing any kind of short retreat, how does a person do a weekend retreat, or a 2-day or a 3-day or a 4-day retreat? How do you set that up? What does it look like? What topics might how do you create your own meditation retreat that's maybe just a weekend? Um, and then at the end of the month, she will be doing a retreat weekend here, again, 10 to 3:30, Saturday and Sunday. It's quite Buddhist, that topic. It's on what's called the 12 links of dependent origination, which is basically how we create karma, how the mind creates karma and how karma ripens and how we create these cycles through. So Buddhist psychology in a way, but it is a topic that you don't find anywhere else. So that's all happening this month. Okay. So, and then in April, I myself, there will be a new Saturday class that will have the same format, different, and it's on the website. You can take a look at it. It is a little bit more, it builds a little bit more than this. They're not just drop in the exact same way. It does have a little bit more continuity to it, but it is still not deeply, it is still this sort of hybrid approach of, focusing on values and things that are a bit more universal. So not so much like karma or reincarnation or the kinds of things that you find that are purely Buddhist, more universal in its tone. Again, it'll be every other week, and it will again be a long class because it's every other week. It'll probably be 6, 7 months. There'll be about 12 classes in total. And then, so that starts in April 4th, I think, the first Saturday in April. So the topic for today's class is, as you can see here on the screen, is courage. The topic is courage. And there were a couple topics in this overall course that we kind of shortened it. I skipped a couple things. But so our last topic will be the idea of courage. And so courage does have, there are, I think, really important ways of talking about courage that connect to historical Buddhist ideas. And of course, it's also just something that as a citizen of the world, that we're called to have a certain bravery in certain circumstances. And as we go along, we'll see how pervasive it is and how really I think how important it is in a spiritual context, because it's kind of an inner resolve. It's sort of an inner strength. It is not, Buddhism talks a lot about not depending upon finding things outside of oneself, for one's sense of well-being, for one's growth, looking internally, and not being affected, having a sense of that there's a way in which by relying on our own sense of right and wrong, our own moral compass, our own wisdom, in a way, relying on the wisdom that we develop over time, that we come to be resilient, in a way that doesn't, where we might be, because the spiritual path, regardless of what it is, it's not shared by a lot of the people around us, right? And so following a spiritual path, particularly in the face of the consumerist culture, the kind of materialistic, kind of surface level, very egocentric, very just about what in Buddhism they would call, the eight worldly concerns, just accumulating wealth, accumulating status, accumulating, reputation, comfort, the kinds of things that we're really encouraged by our society to do. To sort of have a rejection of that is a form of courage, is an incredibly important form of courage. So, and still, there is that, as it says here, there's that fear that we have of being judged by others, of being criticized even, or being thought of as like, well, that's crazy. Like, why are you spending your time doing this? Really, you should be spending your time, doing what I'm doing, or what society wants you to do, or what seems more normal. Um, so, and also, I think, as it says here, this idea of inner work, of course, the spiritual path is a path of inner work, and that facing the things that we're trying to shift is something that is courageous, right? It's so much easier to not do that. It's so much easier to simply, you know, kind of tune out and just sort of watch TV and go to, just to entertain the mind, right? To not look inward, to not turn our attention inward and see, well, what habits, what tendencies, what patterns do I have that are not so great? What do I need to, how do I grow? Like, okay, I have a certain amount of compassion and generosity, patience, ethical conduct today, but in 10 years, wouldn't it be great if I had more patience? If my ethics was stronger, if my compassion was deeper, if my loving kindness was able to embrace a larger group of people, even people that I disagree with, or people that I feel like are working against my interests. Wouldn't it be amazing if I could grow into that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Um, and seeing that disconnect is unpleasant, right? Seeing like, and just even on a daily basis, like, oh, I lost my temper today. It's easy to be like, well, oh, they to justify it, to like, well, they deserved it. They pushed my buttons. They knew they were thoughtless. They were uncaring. And they cut me off in traffic. How dare they? Right? Staying stuck in that kind of narrative not looking at, but I don't want, I don't want that feeling. I don't want to react in anger. I don't want to raise my voice toward other people. I don't want to slam doors or insult people or, try to wound people with my speech. So having that's definitely courage, right? Every single day, turning our awareness inside and looking at the disconnect between where we wish to go, where we understand we could go, and what's happening, in my day, and then being like, okay, well, that wasn't great. What do I do tomorrow to make, a 0.1% shift? And then what do I do the day after that to make another 0.1% shift? And then in, 10 days, you've made a 1% shift. And in 20 days, you've made a 2% shift because it's a long-term project. But there's this balance between complacency and unrealistic expectations, right? That we have to navigate. Um, so yeah, and this is what that internal willingness is what drives our spiritual path is really because if we just give up, right? If we're like, well, we're just stuck, we're just seeing this every single day. We're seeing what hasn't happened yet or what needs to change or what we wish we could, adjust. There's a tendency to just be like, well, this is overwhelming, this is too much. So being able to maintain that courage over time is really what is really the engine that drives overall spiritual growth. So I wanted to spend a few minutes now. We've got some markers and some paper here, and if you're online, you can just open up, some sort of, browser or some sort of Word document, Word. And so this is just for you. You don't have to share what you write with anyone. And if you want to open your phone or use your phone or, whatever, that's fine. But I wanted to kind of frame today's class by spending, maybe 5 minutes just journaling, writing. If you want to just think about it, whatever, totally fine. But these are the three kind of points of reflection that I would like to just have people silently journal about or think about as sort of the frame. Do this for one more minute and then we'll set it aside. All right. So move on. So I wanted to introduce kind of this idea of, in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, I think it could be in part because the person who became known as the Buddha was born into the warrior caste. That's maybe one influence. And then also people say that the original, as the teachings traveled into Tibet, our center is based particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, and the Buddha taught in India, what is present day India and present day Nepal, mostly present day India. um, didn't really ever teach, but eventually the teachings migrated into India. There were different diffusions across the border over time. But I've heard people describe the original Tibetans as quite a warlike people, 3,000 years ago, who kind of became a bit pacified by their exposure to the teachings. So you find a lot of language in the teachings that have kind of these warrior-like, and again, I think it's because, in a way, that it does require that the path, any kind of determined spiritual path, requires inner strength, and that's what they mean. They don't mean and they talk about conquering and but they're talking about overcoming your own shortcomings, your own. You're not conquering other people. You're not, conquering lands, or you're conquering yourself. You're conquering the mind. Um, so they have this. There's a lot of language like this that you find. So there's these three that over in terms of this topic, I would say that there's these three different, concepts that have these overlapping relationships, and we need to cultivate all three of these, simultaneously in order to have a well-rounded spiritual approach. So courage, determination, and equanimity. Um, and then you can see here that the ultimate goal is that when they all three overlap, then we have balanced strength and resolute action. That's kind of, and then, um, we also have steady perseverance, and then even calm risk taking, which means risk taking doesn't mean, doing things that are unwise, but it means doing things that are uncomfortable, doing things that are unknown, um, having a sense of being willing, because we may not, at the very beginning, there's certainly a sense of, well, this makes some sense to me. I can see I can see the logic of it, but we don't really have any direct experience. And so we're kind of saying, I'm willing to engage in this long-term project without actually knowing, based on what other people are saying, based on what the teachings are saying. And over time, it's our own direct experience, but not for a while, right? So we're making these changes in our life, kind of, Buddhism ultimately doesn't encourage us to have blind faith. That's not part of what's encouraged in Buddhism. But there are concepts in Buddhism that what they call deeply hidden phenomenon that we don't have direct knowledge of, and we may be engaging in certain actions for a while, um, taking it on, faith in uh, sources that are reliable, like the Buddha and other great masters, and being willing to engage in certain activities because we don't ourselves yet. We can't confirm or deny that they're true. But Buddhism would say ultimately every person can become a person who can directly see the truth of there are no unknowable mysteries in Buddhism, right? It's just but that doesn't mean that you yourself, because you want to know something, that you can in that moment. Just like if I wished to understand quantum mechanics, well, we live in a world where that is understood, that I could do that. If I applied myself over 20 years, I went to the right schools, I read the right books, I really tried very hard, I was tutored, but I'm taking it on faith, right? I know nothing about it today. And I just have examples in my world of, well, this person spent 20 years and they were able to get a PhD in it. They were able to teach other people. They're able to write books and articles and go on TV and make contributions. So I can do the same thing. It's not an unknowable mystery. I can do it myself. But it's going to take me 20 years. And I don't really, what if they're leading me in the wrong direction? What if I can't really judge for myself that I'm going to reach this end result. All I can do is see in my world that there are examples of other people who've done it. The Buddha is just an example of someone who's done it. And then, we take that as our model and then we move in that direction. So courage, determination, and equanimity are the three pillars of this attitude of someone who has this unshakable willingness to engage in a spiritual path. And when we cultivate those three pillars simultaneously, then the benefits of that are, that we don't suffer from burnout. We have steady day by day willingness to look in our own minds and look at our own shortcomings and make adjustments to our practice to, over time become more compassionate, become more generous, become more patient, become more wise, because we understand that these are not fixed qualities that only some people have, that these are trainable states of mind that we can increase over time. And this can be summed up then in and this has come up, I think once or twice before, as joyful effort, which is one of the six paramitas, the six far-reaching attitudes that is really emphasized in our tradition, joyful effort. So finding on the basis of this internal sense of resolute action, steady effort, we don't see our spiritual practice, our spiritual life, as something that we have to do, as something that we're being told to do. We see it as this path of joy, this thing that we get to do, this thing that is the vehicle by which, over time, we will be able to have greater love, greater compassion, greater generosity, greater patience, stronger ethics. And we see those goals as being goals that we wish to achieve. And so every moment of the process of moving in that direction should be joyful, should be uplifting, doesn't mean that it's always pleasant, right? Understanding how much anger we have, understanding how much jealousy we have, understanding that's again, that's where this armor like joyous effort, comes from. But so it isn't that the observation that there are things that we need to work on is is itself joyful or pleasant, but understanding that I can overcome this, that this is not the fundamental nature of my mind, that I am not stuck, with the amount of anger that I struggle with today, or the amount of jealousy that I struggle with today in this moment, that this is a changeable part of my mind. That's what's joyful, right? Is that it's not fixed, and that tomorrow it can be a little bit better, and the day after that it can be a little bit better if I stick with it, if I learn what methods to employ, I understand what techniques and what inner technologies to bring to bear, then I can actually reduce these so-called negative or destructive states of mind. One thing that is true about Tibetan Buddhism is that they are willing to look at certain states of mind and say that these cause harm to yourself and they cause harm to others. And so, which is different than like secular humanism, where it's like, well, we're made up of a little bit of anger and a little bit of jealousy and that's just what we are. And like, we should just try not to kill people, try not to like steal things. It's a different perspective. Buddhism would say, and that makes sense if it's true that we can't go beyond that. If it's true that there is no choice but to be made up of a little bit of hatred, a little bit of jealousy, then all we can really do is manage it and try not to overtly, really cause harm. But the Buddhist perspective is different. The Buddhist perspective is that our true potential is to move completely beyond any kind of hatred, any kind of jealousy. And so if that's true, then we should label it as something to be overcome, to be transcended, to be eliminated. Um, and so it isn't moralistic, it is a clear seeing that I myself suffer when anger is present in my mind. I myself suffer when jealousy is present in my mind. When ill will, when malice, when envy, I myself am unpeaceful, I myself. And simultaneously with that, the actions that I engage in when that's operating in my mind are very likely to be harmful to those around me. We don't scream at other people when our minds are absorbed in loving kindness. We don't steal things when our mind is absorbed in generosity. We do these negative actions when the mind is under the influence of these states of mind. They are what propel our actions. So it's a clear, non-moralistic way of recognizing that it's painful for myself, causes me to suffer, and it harms those around me. Um, so but this does have to be based on this understanding that none of those states of minds are what I truly am. They're not part of my essential nature. They're just the current habits that I've developed. I've practiced anger, I've practiced jealousy, I've practiced envy. And so they've become something, based on that familiarity, they're what I move into. They're how I relate. Um, and I can develop new habits. I can develop new familiarities. I can develop new ways of thinking and acting and judging and being in relationship with others. Whatever my current habits and tendencies and familiarities are, they can change over time. And that is what gives us this joy. That is what, because we're seeing, I'm doing this work today, tomorrow, and I'm never going to give up and I'm never going to abandon because there's light at the end of this tunnel. I'm not, and if we want to take, the the whole Buddhist package on board, then our potential is unbelievable, is something that isn't presented in any other system, any other philosophical system, the actual capacity of the mind that we have in this moment, our mind, not like, oh, the Buddha could do it because the Buddha had the Buddha's mind. The Buddha had our mind until he didn't, and we're going to have this mind until we don't, right? We're going to struggle with the things that we struggle with until they're overcome, but they can be overcome, which is not, it isn't just like we get to hang out with our relatives, after we die for eternity and eat all the food that we want. And that's, it's a very different perspective of what we're capable of, what our true potential is. Um, okay. Yeah, so these are some of this is how this might manifest in our lives when we develop those three qualities of equanimity, determination, and courage. Then these are some of what flow, from that. These are the benefits or what can arise from that. So now we will talk in a bit more, or we'll relate these ideas a bit more to traditional Buddhist ideas, Tibetan Buddhist ideas, by talking about this concept of bodhicitta, which is the highest, most sublime intention or motivation that exists within the Tibetan Buddhist framework. It literally means the mind of awakening, that the transliteration of the word bodhi means awakening, and chitta means mind. So it means the mind of awakening. And in Buddhism, the idea of mind and heart really are the same. They don't have a separate understanding. So you can call it the awakening mind, the heart of awakening. Um, so there's absolute and relative bodhicitta. And we won't go into the idea of absolute bodhicitta is a very but it relates to the things that we've been talking about, right? We're not going to go into it in a deep philosophical sense, but what we've been talking about is that right now we are made up of tendencies and habits, and they're not fixed, right? And so that's ultimately this idea is that um, the mind itself is changeable. The mind itself is what's called clarity. And, at its most fundamental, our mind, our consciousness is just clarity and awareness, right? It's just an energy that observes and develop and generates some sort of internal representation of what we observe. And the more we do things, the more we practice patience, the more we practice impatience, the more we practice generosity, the more we practice miserliness, or just the mind of wanting to accumulate, or be stingy, then the mind will move in that direction, will become like that. And so if we were fixed, or if we only had, a certain amount of loving kindness, if we only had a certain amount of, then it would always be the same, right? We may feel that way because we've never really devoted ourselves to intense, long-term paths of intentional transformation. So it may feel like, well, I was the same yesterday, I was the same before that, I'm going to be the same tomorrow. We may feel that, but that's really a choice of, I've not really thought a lot about that. I don't have to be stuck in these habits, these patterns, these tendencies, that my mind isn't one with or the same as how much generosity or patience or jealousy or malice I presently have. Because if it's true that the historical Buddha, in all of his amazingness, was an ordinary person at some point in the past, then the mind must be like this. The mind must simply be clarity and awareness, and it must not be fixed in the way that we kind of perceive it to be. We kind of think, well, my personality is all that there is, the amount of, all of these states of mind that I'm presently comfortable with, presently familiar with, habituated to, that's just sort of the way things are. And Buddhism would argue against that. They would say that the capacity of the mind is something unfathomable. Um, and when we study that and we understand that and we really take that on board, then that gives us, again, the courage to follow through on our plans to transform the mind. And then so that's called absolute bodhicitta, or the recognition of our own actual true nature, um, not being tied to this is who I am. I like the things that I like. I don't like the things that I don't like. I'm this patient. I'm this kind, and that's it. It's out of my control. Um, and then relative bodhicitta is using the wisdom that we gain from absolute bodhicitta, in that I can develop my mind, I can grow these qualities, and I ought to do that in order to benefit others. I ought to do that in order to, mainly because, again, a spiritual path isn't just for oneself. It isn't, there's certainly benefits, right? We know that if we reduce our malice, if we grow in our patience, if we become more wise, more kind, more generous, certainly we are the primary beneficiaries of that because it's our mind, right? We get to live with our mind every moment of every day. So all of those benefits, primarily we're experiencing, but also they are beneficial to everyone around us too, because we are the actions that we will engage in under the influence of these more constructive states of mind, will naturally bring benefit to others. When you're around someone who's patient, who's kind, who's generous, who's ethical, you yourself are, you might not be like that, but being in the presence of that other person who is like that will bring benefit to you. So relative bodhicitta is engaging in this path of transforming the mind, principally thinking about how that inner transformation leads you to be of benefit to those around you, and how you can use your newfound skills, abilities, capacities to be helpful to other people. Um, and that's really the core of this. So these ideas really are the core of historical, typical Tibetan Buddhism. It isn't the reason that in our tradition, the reason that we cultivate the courage to transform the mind is because we recognize that these the word is often afflictive is the word, maybe a little bit charged of a word, but hatred, jealousy, envy, so on, because these are painful for oneself, we recognize, well, everybody else is in the same boat, right? Hatred is painful in my mind, hatred is painful in their minds, right? And we may come into our spiritual lives just not wanting to suffer ourselves, right? But eventually, over time, we see that suffering is universal, that I myself suffer because I have hatred, I have jealousy, I have envy, I have, all of these afflicted states. And that's also the reason that every other living being is in pain. That's also the reason why they're causing chaos in the world, why they're engaging in their negative actions, why they are harming others, is when that's arising. And so I want to go beyond just fixing this for myself. I want to help other people see that they can fix it for themselves too. But but if I'm still under the influence of all of these things, I'm not that helpful. I'm not that like I'm a little bit helpful, right? But the more I can free myself from what's happening, the suffering states that I'm experiencing, then the more and more beneficial I am to others. Um, so that's why in Tibetan Buddhism, that's really the root of why people do what they do. Okay. Let me pause here before we move on to the next slide. Have I said anything that has given rise to a thought or a question? We have a microphone on that chair that we need to use for the Zoom people so they can hear us or hear you. But is there anything like that going on? All right. Anybody online that would like to ask a question? You can just unmute yourself and do that.
I don't have a question, but I'd like to say I'm sorry I'm late and hello.
No worries. Right. So we'll move on. We'll move on. Okay. So you may ask, like, what is the principal vehicle in Buddhism for training in courage? Um, and I would say it's Tonglen in one way. Tonglen is giving and taking, and it is a meditation that we can learn, and it's what we'll practice today. We all of these classes are part lecture, part small group discussion, and part meditation. So we'll do small group discussion and we'll do meditation after I stop yapping. So the meditation is Tonglen that we'll do. And basically, so the purpose of Tonglen is really to train in courage. It is to train in developing the mind that is willing to look at the suffering of others and confront it directly. And that's what courage is. Um, and yeah, and so it'll make more sense when we do it. But that is that is, I would say, if we want to train in becoming more courageous, then from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, the Tonglen meditation is one of the most effective ways of turning, because courage is turning toward suffering, turning toward our own sources and causes of suffering, and turning toward suffering in others, not shrinking away from it. Right, when we aren't willing to look at our own mind, our own stuff, that's a lack of courage, right? That's like, well, this is hard. I don't want to do it. I just want to, just let me watch a movie. That's a lack. That would be a lack of courage. And when we don't stay open or stay present or stay helpful when other people are suffering, that's also, because we're going in, we're withdrawing, in a way. And that's also a lack of a willingness to stay present with the suffering of others. Okay. So this is, well, we'll just come back to this later. So I guess I don't have a specific slide for small group discussion. Let me. Okay. So, I guess just try to remember what I say for the discussion. So there's just a couple different points, and you've got pieces, maybe somebody can just write it down. You don't have to cover all of these things, but these are some ideas that you can use as a jumping off point for the discussion. So one, there's four. The first is the relationship between courage and vulnerability. The second is how courage feels different from recklessness. And then the third is the role of your values in determining when courage is required. And we'll just use those three. So the relationship between courage and vulnerability, how courage feels different from recklessness, and the role of your values in determining what requires courage. Those are some discussion points. So I will leave, and I will leave for 15 minutes. And the people online, this doesn't get recorded. This isn't on the internet. So feel free to say whatever you want. And that's true of you guys online as well. You guys can, the four of you, three of you online can use those discussion points. And then the people in the Gompa here as well. And that's all gets cut out. So privacy is protected. Honesty, I think that the spiritual path is fundamentally rooted, from the Buddhist perspective, is fundamentally rooted in seeing clearly, and everything flows. So it's a longer conversation in terms of, but from the Buddhist perspective, we shouldn't do anything that isn't rooted in wisdom, right? I mean, compassion, generosity, patience, ethics, all of these things that we're trying to cultivate. They're not just things that the Buddha says are pro-social, or they're good ideas, or they flow naturally from a wisdom mind that understands interdependence, interrelatedness, that understands the nature of mind, the nature of self. Again, how the mind and the self are not fixed and static, and they're changeable, um, and so. But when we are trying to move in that direction, there can be some self-deception, right? About, like, again, like I was saying, we have this I mean, if it was easy to have great love and great compassion and great patience, and then we wouldn't need places of learning, and we wouldn't need meditation, because it would just be natural, right? Unfortunately, it's much easier to be, you know, looking after our own interests, or we've talked about in all of these, self-grasping, self-cherishing, which sounds like a good thing, but it's actually putting your own needs above, isn't taking care of oneself. It's looking at one's own interests and thinking that they are more important, not equally important, but more important than the needs of all other, you know, these are obstacles to our spiritual growth. So, and it's so much easier to simply operate on that level, right? And when we start to see, that there's this gulf between where we could go and where we are, that does require being vulnerable, right? With, it's not really critical. It isn't like, oh, I'm terrible. Oh, it's just, oh, I'm ordinary. Oh, I'm like everybody else. Everybody struggles with jealousy and malice, and to one degree or another. Some people have more of one and less of the other, and some people are like really, they want to just accumulate stuff, but they're really patient. They're not angry people, but they're just so interested in just getting more and more and more. Other people, maybe, they're quite, um, you know, um, kind, with the people around them, but at the same time, um, you know, they um, they have a lot of, fear around, loss and so on, and so they also have this, hoarding mentality, or this, that they can't let go of things, or they're just, that they have, incredible attachment to other people, and that, like, they need to be validated. They need to be, they have this, or like, attachment to reputation, like, in a way, they have this incredible need to be validated, to be, respected, to be spoken to kindly, politely. But they're kind to people. They go out of their way to be, but they have this neediness, this hunger, this internal hunger to be validated, to be. So we're all a mixture of all of these things. And when we develop this willingness to really think about what my pattern is, what my habits are, what my tendencies are, um, and not shy away from that, that's, really vulnerable. And then also, when we're acting in the world to try, we're going to make mistakes too, about when we don't, our wisdom is limited, right? We want to help other people, but we don't know what, like, we're not positive that I'm going to say the right thing, I'm going to do the right thing. But if we have the courage to act anyway, to say, well, to just say, well, it would be wrong for me to say, well, I shouldn't do anything because I might get it wrong, or I might say the wrong thing, or I might do the wrong thing, might actually not be that helpful. So I'm just going to stay silent. I'm going to stay. Then opening ourselves up to being criticized for doing the wrong thing, or saying the wrong thing, or, you know, we're just doing our best, right? And that's also very vulnerable, to be like, I'm actually going to, when I see suffering, I'm going to try to do something about suffering, in my own mind and in the minds of others and in the lives of others, even knowing that that's not always going to go well. Um, and, I could be criticized for doing that. I could be, but still, it doesn't matter. I know internally that I'm in that moment, I used the most wisdom that I had, the best judgment that I had. And in 10 years, I'll have better wisdom, I'll have better judgment, and I'll make better choices. But still, you know, it would be inappropriate for me to do nothing. So I'm not going to do nothing. That's also, even though I could, you could go to jail, for that. I mean, there's people, I have a lot of respect for, there's some videos about, the different clergy members, like in Minneapolis and things, they were silent, they were respectful, they weren't screaming, they weren't shouting, they weren't throwing bottles, they were sitting, they were praying, and they got arrested, right? I have a lot of respect for that kind of way of being in the world. Not so much the violence, and because that's also just another way of, I mean, I understand feeling attacked and feeling and responding out of that anger. That's understandable, but not helpful, not the screaming, the shouting, the throwing things, lighting cars on fire. That's not helpful. It's understandable, but it's counterproductive. But these clergy members, Catholics and Protestants and all kinds of, they were acting they were willing to not do nothing. They were willing to, even put their bodies, their lives on the line, because two people were murdered, Um, so I think they were murdered, but uh, so anyway. Okay, so we'll do the meditation. So we'll get into, so just find a comfortable position, upright position, stable position, nothing fancy. And just think about letting go of attending to what's happening in your environment, pulling your awareness back, constraining it to the body, to the mind, letting go of thoughts of the past, plans for the future, and starting to concentrate your awareness by attending to the physical sensation that accompanies the in-breath and the out-breath, and the space around the opening of the nostrils, breathing naturally, normally, and just attending to that one physical sensation, giving yourself the instruction to quickly notice when the mind moves to any other object, as it will. And when that happens, just lifting your awareness up from those distractions and returning to that one physical sensation. Settling the mind. And then think of a way in which you yourself experience suffering from time to time. It could be mental or physical. And imagine a future version of yourself is seated in front of you, and they're experiencing that. This unpleasant mental or physical experience that you have deep familiarity with. And imagine that that suffering takes on the aspect of a smoke surrounding the body of this future version of yourself. And smoke is in the nature of that painful experience. and observing this suffering happening in front of you, try to develop a genuine wish for you yourself to be free of this suffering. A deep, visceral, felt experience of longing, wishing. Concentrate on that subjective state of mind, what it feels like. Begin to imagine that due to the force of your own compassionate wish, that smoke, that suffering begins to be drawn off of that future version of yourself in front. It begins to funnel from that person toward yourself in meditation. It begins to funnel faster and faster. And imagine that this cloud penetrates at your heart center. And there at the heart center, you imagine a small dark seed, like a mustard seed, sesame seed. And this cloud is absorbed into this dark seed at your heart center. And it becomes more and more dense as it takes on this suffering. And then as the suffering, this dark cloud, is completely absorbed, and this dark seed implodes, and it's replaced by a much larger orb of golden white light at the heart. That dark seed represented the mind that doesn't want suffering, the mind that turns away from suffering. And it was covering this potential, deep, loving kindness, compassion, which is represented by this orb of golden white light. Now imagine that this person in front of you, being freed of their suffering, also deeply wishes to be happy, to be truly content, at ease, at peace. So imagine now deeply wishing that for them, for yourself, this future version of yourself. True happiness, deep, abiding contentment. Imagine sending out rays of light that are in the nature of that happiness. And they absorb into this future version of yourself in front. And imagine becoming this future version, becoming blissfully content, fully satisfied. As you offer your love and compassion. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. All right. That's a good way to have an entry point into that technique, is to start because you we've talked in all of, a lot of these previous classes, how what we're really trying to do is grow the seeds of all of these positive mental states. No one is completely bereft. I mean, maybe some, hopefully none of us are like, truly sociopath, psychopath. There's some brain conditions, I think, that maybe cause people to not be able to tap into certain parts of their mind. And that's deeply unfortunate. But generally speaking, ordinary people don't have these conditions. Um, we have a certain amount of love and kindness and so on. And the goal is to grow it. The goal is to, it's not, these are not completely foreign concepts. If you had no basis of understanding compassion, generosity, you couldn't grow it. It would be impossible if it was a completely foreign concept that made no sense to you. But luckily, we have the seeds of all of these positive states of mind, and the goal is to grow them. So we find it quite easy to wish ourselves to be free of suffering, right? So we start there, where we use that as a way of demonstrating to ourselves, what does it genuinely feel like when I wish someone to be free of their suffering, and then when I wish them to be happy? What is the true, actual, subjective experience of that? We can't use, someone that we hate, someone that to begin with, to get a real clear understanding of that subjective experience. It's quite good to start with oneself. And then you work with that for a few weeks. Then you start to think about, and it is true, some people have a hard time taking themselves as the object. That's not uncommon. Um, just because we also don't think about, um, we're not maybe that familiar with that way of thinking about ourselves. So you can use, if you struggle with it, that's not that uncommon. You can certainly use, either, if you don't struggle with it, great to start there, or start with a loved one or a pet, or someone that whatever is going to trigger that genuine subjective experience. If you're starting with yourself, then you would move on to people you care for, other people, and then you would move on to strangers, right? So you work with yourself a few weeks, work with loved ones for a few weeks, then move on to strangers for a few weeks. And then you can start working with people that agitate you, people that bother you a little bit, because we naturally find it more difficult to truly wish them to be free of their suffering, to truly wish for them to be happy. The goal is and of course, people sometimes misunderstand or think that this meditation technique is about relieving other people of their suffering, and it isn't. If your loved one has cancer and you use them as your object, and you think about taking on, in this way, doing this, they're still going to have cancer when you're done with your meditation, unfortunately. But you are going to be more comfortable in their presence. You're going to be able to be open and aware even when you see them suffering, because we want to run away from the suffering of others, even if it's a loved one, because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And so that's the point of this meditation, is turning toward the suffering of others and not running away from the suffering of others, which is a training in courage, right? So the goal isn't that magically we're doing what we're imagining. The goal isn't that magically other people become free of their suffering, but we learn the resiliency and the openness and the awareness to be with suffering, and to be okay with, being active in the face of suffering. Um, and of course, this is a coarser level of suffering that we're working with here. You can certainly use the suffering that results from the states of mind that the suffering that it results from the anger that other people have, the suffering that when we're talking about illness, or we're talking about anxiety or depression, these are coarser levels of suffering. There are subtler levels of suffering, like the suffering that results from simply being deeply habituated to malice, deeply habituated to jealousy, and so on. Those are sufferings. Absolutely. And you can work with those too. Just to give some more context and some more ideas about how to, gradually use this over time. But we're out of time for today. Yeah, so are there any final thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Okay, so it's April before there's a new Saturday class that I'm have anything to do with, but Elaine is doing, as I said, a number of things this month. And yeah, and there's also lots of things online. If when people come here, they're usually not Zoom people, but there are lots of things online as well. We do a 30-minute meditation Monday through Friday at 7:30. It's only on Zoom, but you can do it before you go to work, 30 minutes to kind of we call it, setting your day, getting started in the right direction, 30 minutes, 7:30 to 8 a.m. Yes, yeah, it's on the calendar, Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 8. Different people do different days. Um, all right. Well, thanks for coming. I didn't think we'd get through all 30. I thought we would peter out after two or three classes back in June when we started. So I had a fun time. So